Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Purple Pill Philosophy is interviewing the legendary pop scholar Michael Heiser. How are you lately?
Good. I didn't know I was legendary. Am I really that old? I hope my kids don't listen to this. So,
Uh, Tell the dear audience about yourself.
well, for the last 15 years, almost 15 years, I was the scholar in residence at Faith Life Corporation. They are the makers of Logos Bible software. It's in Bellingham, Washington. I still live in the state of Washington, but we're going to be moving to Jacksonville soon in a few months, where I'm going to be the executive director of a new school that's both physical and distance, Awakening School of Theology, it's called. So it's the first year is going to focus on my content, for lack of a better term, and the second year is just kind of whatever I care about. It's really for anybody in the world who just wants 2 years of biblical theological education. We're not going to pursue accreditation deliberately. We're not interested in that. We're more interested in the non-specialist, just the person in the local church who's going to be doing ministry, to get a better handle on biblical theology and a whole assortment of topics, without costing them 100K. I mean, something has to be done here. So we're going to jump into that. Before Faith Life, I've taught for about 20 years on the Green Campus and distance ed for, I don't know, half a dozen different institutions, religious, Catholic school, evangelical school, secular university. So I've taught a lot, published a lot. I published peer-reviewed journal articles, several books. I do a lot of writing for again, the popular audience as well. So I'm kind of all over the place. I have a YouTube channel that focuses on sort of responses to fringe beliefs, things like ancient aliens. I mean, I've always been into, pop culture stuff. So I do that. I do a couple podcasts. Naked Bible Podcast is the big one. We crossed 6 million downloads this year.
Oh, cool.
So that's in the total, I think it's about 4 or 5 years or something like that. So that's biblical studies. I have a Paranormal podcast where we go through peer-reviewed literature on topics that would go under the paranormal label. I write fiction too. I mean, you can find me in a lot of places. I like anything old and weird. Always have. And biblical studies is, the wheelhouse. That's where my training is, and professionally, what I've done. But I'm in all sorts of places.
Interesting. One of the main topics in the unseen realm, which is what we're interviewing about tonight, is the use of literary polemic by the biblical authors. Of course, Bible bashers who don't know any better will see how similar in many instances in the Old Testament are to stories and myths outside the Bible, in other Near Eastern sources, and go along with the caricature that the Israelites were these stupid Bronze Age sheep herders that had no original ideas of their own. And then make the they make the non sequitur that Yahweh is contrived a Canaanite storm god because it was said to have created the world exactly the way the Egyptian and Babylonian gods did, flooded the world as the Mesopotamian gods did, and battled the chaos dragon as a certain champion god did in each pantheon. So
yeah, because if we were writing polemic, we would want to make it sound as dissimilar to the thing we're shooting at as possible, right? I mean, how would it be a polemic then?
Yeah.
How would anybody know? That's the most cleverly disguised polemic that's ever been produced.
Yeah.
You're right. It's kind of an absurd set of assumptions. These people are living in the same place, regionally. The notion that they could all be writing about, a recollected event doesn't seem to occur to some of these, Bible bashers, as you referred to them. And even if it did, if you're writing a polemic, if you're writing against someone's worldview or someone's theology, of course you're going to dip into it, because the people you want to get the message would never get the message if you're writing about something altogether different. and you weren't using their material. This is like the most normal thing in the world. If you want to, write something that addresses a specific something else, well, the people who are reading it have to be able to tell that that's what you're doing. It also sort of presumes that texts and beliefs are the same and coterminous. They are not. In other words, a people, Israelites will just say, can believe something for centuries, for millennia, before ever writing it down. They could pass it on orally. I mean, oral culture is a big deal in the ancient world. So the idea that they didn't believe something until we have a text for something is just, again, pardon the expression, it's just boneheaded. It just fails to make this basic distinction. Now, I understand that's an easy thing to forget because we try to deal with primary source data, and the primary source data that exists for us is stuff that was written. I mean, I get it. That's just a reflex. You go to the text. I'm a text guy, so I understand that. But people have to realize that, hey, when the guy sat down and when he took a seat on his butt and he started writing something with a pen, that isn't the first time he had a thought. It's also not the first time his people had a thought. It's not, and his ancestors, were not people who had no thoughts prior to that event. I mean, these are the simplest, most obvious things in the world, but somehow they tend to escape critics, again, especially amateur critics, but they'll even escape, scholars, because again, we're sort of riveted. We get this little kind of myopic, tunnel vision here on the text, and we kind of forget that, well, we can't really make statements about a people's intellectual, repository and have that be coterminous with texts. Thinking and writing are two different things. One came after the other. It just, again, it's very obvious when you think about it, but a lot of people don't think about it. So I would ask, hey, please, could you think about that before, criticizing too much?
Yeah, and also given the notion that the Old Testament relays like unscientific things back then that we know are wrong, like there comes the non sequitur that they were wrong about God as well.
Right. Because, let's put it in religious terms, because this is what people are usually shooting at. So they'll take somebody who believes that God is behind the Bible, that God is the ultimate point of origin for this. Nobody I know believes that God was the immediate point of origin, like humans didn't write the stuff. I mean, this is not an X-Files episode, okay? The Bible is not a channeled book, and it never claims to be a channeled book. God used people. And if those people that God chooses aren't giving us science that would satisfy a 20th and 21st century audience, well, that might tell us that the God who prompted those people to write wasn't really interested in that. Because if he's a deity, he probably could have picked somebody better or waited to the 20th or 21st century to accomplish that if that was his purpose. So since that doesn't get accomplished, the logical thought would be, well, he probably had something else in mind that wasn't concerned with science. Again, when you actually stop to think about what the assumptions are, again, we're assuming, God for the sake of the conversation here, if God is behind this and God is providentially preparing people to write and moving them to get this or that down, or putting them in the right time and place so that they'll produce this thing that he's going to use later on in somebody else's life. If you string all those things together, and they extend just from the simple thought of theism, what's more coherent? God exists or he doesn't. That's the beginning point for all this stuff. So if you're gonna concatenate those things, and then something that's produced doesn't satisfy a modern worldview, again, the logical conclusion wouldn't be that the deity forgot something or did a boo-boo. Okay, the logical conclusion would be, well, that probably wasn't even in the picture. Probably didn't care. And so, again, that's actually my view. So I kind of get a kick out of people who criticize the Bible for not being what it wasn't supposed to be. And I'll ask them, do you get mad at your dog for not being a cat? Do you get mad at your son for not being a daughter? I mean, if you can explain how your method, how your approach makes any sense, then, we can have a discussion about that. But the approach doesn't make any sense to me. And so I tend to be critical of the approach, back at the approach, for those reasons.
Yeah. The main verses behind the theme of Unseen Realm are Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, yet most mainstream scholars such as Marcus Smith, John Day, William Dever, Pete Enns, and many others hold that these verses mean something different than you and other scholars like Richard Elliott Friedman and Richard Hess do.
Mm-hmm.
Like
and by the way, Friedman and Hess are also mainstream scholars, so I am not out of the mainstream, but I know what you mean.
Like Deuteronomy 32, originally meaning that Yahweh was originally a minor desert god that was given territory by the Most High, incidentally El, and Psalm 82 having Yahweh in the role of Baal in the Baal cycle, when he rises up and challenges the gods. Like, I think Anderson did a peer-reviewed article on it. The Christian and Jewish scholars among them are, of course, just relaying what they believed the Israelites back then thought, not what is actually the case.
Mm-hmm. I would say for your audience, if your audience wants sort of a place to go online, for my thoughts on this in more detail, they should go to Google and Google drmsh.com and then the keywords Psalm 82, monotheism, and archive. I've created a page where I archive my papers on this that are, published, but you can still access them online for free. Let me just say, since you threw Pete Enns into the mix here, in theory, I don't have a problem with the notion that God could have told biblical writers or led biblical writers to certain thoughts about himself in stages. In other words, I think it's a myth on the other side. And I think this would, I don't know if Pete's shooting at this or not, but I think some scholars could shoot at this, so I'm going to bring it up. The notion that the biblical writers all had the same thoughts about God all at the same time, or that over time they never could have changed. I think that's a myth. I mean, God certainly could have told them a little bit here and then later on a little bit more, corrected this or that, because other doctrines develop through Scripture. Kingdom of God is a real obvious one, but there are a number of things that develop over time. So in principle, I'm not opposed to that. My problem with it is that I don't think it makes sense because of the data. And I think a lot of the arguments promoting the evolutionary trajectory simply do not make sense and are actually easily contradicted by data. Let me just give you some examples here. There's an assumption that Elohim, plural Elohim. Mm-hmm. Elohim is a Hebrew term that's often, most of the time, used for the God of Israel. It's sort of becomes a generic term, but it can also be plural, gods, put an S on the end of it. Well, there's an assumption that, hey, in passages where it should be translated plural, that shows polytheism. And you ask, well, why? Well, it's because they're gods there. Okay. Why is it then that biblical writers would use the same term Elohim of the disembodied dead in 1 Samuel 28:13, or they use the term in the plural for the gods of the nations, while they're saying Yahweh is the God Elohim of all Elohim? That tells you that the biblical writers aren't using the term to state an ontology. Okay, because they would be hopelessly muddled in their thinking. It tells you that they're not the Elohim aren't all the same. They're not just interchangeable. And in fact, the biblical writers take great pains to deny certain attributes to other Elohim. Again, Elohim has nothing to do with a set of specific attributes. But since that's the way we think about the letters G, O, and D in modern times, we assume that biblical writers thought the same way about the word Elohim. See, when we see the letters G, O, and D on a page or on a screen, because we're Western, because we're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, our brains just default to, oh, G, O, and D, that's omniscience, eternality, omnipotence, omnipresence, all this string of attributes. And so when you put an S on it, it creeps people out. Well, that's we can't have that. But we assume, again, that the biblical writer is using Elohim and thinking the same way about that term when they're not. And how do we know? Well, because of the way they use it. So this is why in my writing I say something, look, this notion that Elohim has something to do with a unique set of attributes, and therefore when it's plural we have polytheism. There's something wrong with that, because it leads us to absurd conclusions, like a biblical writer would have thought that his dead infant, who's now part of the disembodied spiritual world, is on the ontological level with Baal or Yahweh. That's ridiculous. Nobody's going to believe that. There's no proof for anybody thinking in these terms, but they're all Elohim. So there must be, no. Let's try to think a little bit better about the term. All the term means, you would use Elohim as a biblical writer to describe any entity, any resident of the disembodied spiritual world, regardless of their ontology or regardless of where they are in the hierarchy. Elohim is like a synonym for ruchot, spirits, spirit beings. Okay, that's what it is. So that's one problem, and there are just a number of these. Like a year ago, we had our first Naked Bible conference, and that's the name of my podcast, Naked Bible Podcast. And so I did a presentation on the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls in regard to this assumption, because you'll read in literature, scholarly literature, that, well, when we get to the Second Temple period, that's the intertestamental period, and especially the Hellenistic era, the biblical writers are they don't want to see other gods, okay, because they've evolved to monotheism now, and the other gods are dead, or they want them to be dead, or gosh, they hope they're dead, or something like that. And so now they talk about angels instead of gods. Well, the Septuagint translators, sorry, they didn't get the memo. Because if you actually look at all the places where the Septuagint translators have to render Elohim, they go from Hebrew Elohim to Greek, there's only 3 or 4 of those instances where you don't have theoi, or some plural of theos, gods. So they don't have any trouble having gods in the Hellenistic era in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's the same thing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 180. I know because I counted them. This is part of my dissertation. There are 180 or a little bit more instances of Elohim in the plural in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And 15 or 20 of those are specifically in divine council passages, these quote-unquote pantheon passages. Now, I've got news for you. The very same language that supposedly before the exile that Israelites, they were polytheists, and then by the time they emerged from the exile, they've achieved the breakthrough of monotheism, and they're denying all these other gods exist. Well, the very same terminology that's in pre-exilic texts is in post-exilic texts, word for word, phrase for phrase, and it's about 6 or 7 times more. Okay, so how does the evolutionary trajectory conform to those data? That's what I want to know. Okay, but nobody ever looks. I can point you to articles, and I do this in my published articles, where I'm not going to give the person's name here. People can go get the article. It's the one on the Tyndale Bulletin on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, there are scholars who will articulate this idea that we've transitioned from Elohim to angels, and they'll be quoting Dead Sea Scroll text, and they'll quote 5 or 6 texts in the article. If you look at the text, the word for angel never appears. It's still the plural word for gods, Elohim and Elim. The word for angel, Malach or Malachim, doesn't even appear in the text. But they're making an argument for this transition and quoting texts that don't even represent what they're saying. Now you say, how can they do that? It's because they've just been taught the paradigm. Nobody questions it. I could just go on and on with this. To be fair to your audience, this is my dissertation, so I kind of swim here. You know, okay, Psalm 82, or let's Deuteronomy 32, El giving Yahweh a piece of turf. Well, that's wonderful until you do two things. Until you look at Deuteronomy 4, 19 through 20, which everyone in the literature knows is the parallel to Deuteronomy 32:8. It says, beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. Things that the Lord your God has allotted. There's the language, from Deuteronomy 32:8. He's allotted them to all the peoples under the whole heaven, but Yahweh, the Lord, has taken you. He doesn't get it like, oh, thank you, El. Thanks for this little piece of land. No, he takes it as his own. So that language doesn't reflect there. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 32 and verses 6 and 7, guess what? We have El and Baal epithets attributed to the lone Yahweh in the two verses prior. So the question is, if we have polytheism in verse 8, why is the polytheism messed up in verses 6 and 7 when they're identifying the two with the one? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And you get scholars. Go ahead.
It's argued that 32:8 was reflecting an older tradition.
Oh, of course, because everybody listen out there, sit down. If you're driving, roll, turn off to the side of the road, okay? Because we all know that manuscripts come with dates on them, don't we? No, we don't. It's a guess. It's an assumption that is brought to the text as to when a manuscript variant, this difference, happened. You have to impose a chronology on the texts and then argue after your imposition of your chronology to that conclusion. And all I'm saying is, look, you can't, there's no way to know when these changes happen. And you know what? It wouldn't matter if it was older, because I'm arguing on the basis of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, all this other stuff, that on both sides of the chronology, you get the same phrases. Again, there's no idea that the Septuagint translation is pre-exilic. Nobody in there, unless they occupy an insane asylum, would say that, okay? We know when the Septuagint was translated, and they are perfectly free to use plural Elohim, B'nai Elohim, the phrases of Deuteronomy 32:8 in that late material and the Dead Sea Scrolls are even later than that. So it is I got to be blunt, it's a lame argument to just move that back as though it means something. It's not a meaningful statement, because the same language shows up exponentially more often after this evolution to monotheism has supposedly taken place. And I know that I'm in the minority here, because I did my dissertation on this at a secular university. My advisor was Jewish, but to his credit, he found the topic interesting, even though it ran contrary, to some fundamental things. But my work here has passed peer review on a number of levels here. I'm not just making stuff up. I'm saying here are data that are not being thought about well, that are just sort of not even looked at. And in some cases, we're making claims that the data actually contradict. So we need to do a little bit better here. Now, I would never argue something as silly as all Israelites believed in the lone Yahweh, the ontologically unique Yahweh. Of course they didn't. It's going to be like today. I mean, you can't even get Christians to, people who would call themselves Christians, you can't even get them to agree on Trinitarian articulation. Even the groups that claim a Trinity will talk about it differently, Eastern Orthodox versus like evangelical or something like that. And then you'll have Christians who are oneness Pentecostals. You can't even get people to agree now on really fundamental things. So of course, in the ancient world, it's not monolithic, but my argument is the biblical writers, and we're looking at their material. This is the text. The text as we have it, taken in context with all this other data, does not justify this evolutionary perspective. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. It's based upon semantic misunderstanding and in some cases exclusion of data, and in other cases just really kind of poor thinking about data.
While we're on that topic, do you hold that Yahweh and El are different versions of the same Almighty God that were seen as distinct by many Israelites, like given the anti-El polemic we see in Hosea, as Chalmers argues? Or is the latter a more perverted version of the former, or
Well,
is it more complicated than that?
you can have both, because you can have the biblical writers saying, look, we're trying to produce this thing that people later are going to call the Hebrew Bible to make the point to you Israelites out there that this El and Baal thing from Canaan, we're not doing that. I mean, I have a whole published article on, and this is drawn from my dissertation, on the divine council co-regency structure from Canaan to Israel. And in Canaan, you had El and Baal, 1 and 2. All right, regent, co-regent. In the Hebrew Bible, you also have two structures, regent and co-regent, but they're both occupied by Yahweh figures. One is the transcendent, invisible Yahweh. The other one is the visible Yahweh, the one that appears as a man. So what my argument is that the biblical writers are essentially adapting, or coming up with their own version of a king co-regent structure that would have been known from the ancient world, just sort of across the board, really. But they're looking at the spiritual world this way, but they're rejecting the notion of two separate deities, El and Baal, running the show. And for them, it's Yahweh in essentially two Yahwehs. The Yahweh occupies both slots, and this is the beginning. This is the kernel, source, point of origin for what would later develop in Judaism as the two powers in heaven idea. Right. That used to be part of Jewish theology.
Right, the angel of the Lord being the second Yahweh.
Right. There's all sorts of ways that I think this regent and co-regent structure are conveyed. And so you could have a biblical writer trying to articulate a point of that, and you could still have an anti-El epithet, because they're trying to get people out of the Canaanite pantheon structure thing. They don't want them going down that road because it affirms two separate deities, and they're trying to get them to think a different way about who runs the heavens, who runs the show. And it sounds, I mean, to a Christian it doesn't sound so weird, because Christians have this concept of a Godhead, but you think, well, the Israelites wouldn't have been thinking that way. Well, yeah, they actually really could, and it's not just Mike. I mean, after my dissertation was done, after I'm out a few years, Benjamin Summer at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. I mean, he's not a Christian or an evangelical. He's Jewish. Okay, he's a rabbinic scholar, ancient Near Eastern scholar. He came out with a book called Bodies of God. And if there's Christians in your audience, you're going to have to forgive Summer, because if you read his book, he's going to sound like a modalist sometimes, but he's not sensitive to the way to the Christian debates on how to talk about the Godhead are. So cut him a break. But he says point blank in his books that the idea of a Godhead, specifically a Trinitarian Godhead, is completely compatible with the Hebrew Bible. Now, you cannot make a statement like that, A, and not know the data, and B, think like this evolutionary trajectory thing. It's not consistent. So, I don't think the biblical writers are like coming up with a new deity and they're smashing the other two together. I think it is more complicated than that. I think they're trying to help people, help the Israelites focus on the one God of Israel, but yet they're again, I don't know, because I wasn't there either. I don't know if the right word is adapting, or again presenting a similar idea in a different way, or what. I don't know what the right vocabulary is for that, but they want people to affirm that there's only one deity in charge of everything. He could be a regent and co-regent. He could be two persons, because you're going to have passages where the invisible Yahweh and the visible Yahweh are present at the same time and yet distinguished. Okay, there is this talk in the Hebrew Bible. There really is. The Jewish community for 4 or 5 centuries in the Second Temple period, who felt very free to debate on the identity of the second Yahweh figure, they're getting that from somewhere, and they're getting it from their Hebrew Bible. They're not just making it up. Okay, it is in the Hebrew Bible. It's just that a lot of Jews, I would say 99% of Jews today, don't know about it because it was declared a heresy later in the 2nd century AD, which again, I don't think is coincidental. That coincides with the birth of, the Jesus movement, or, the early church. And I don't mean to sound like it's anything sinister. The Jewish community there is doing what you would expect them to do. They're circling the wagons. They're trying to keep people from becoming Christians because the Christians are just saying, look, we know who the second Yahweh figure is. The one that came as a man in the Old Testament. Well, he really came as a man this time because of the incarnation. It's this Jesus guy. I mean, they're going down the whole road and they're proposing Jesus of Nazareth as a new candidate for the second power. And that's just too much, for the Jewish community. It's a big element in the parting of the ways. And so the Jewish community is taking steps to just run this, to try to prevent this leakage from their own community. So they declare the second power discussion a heresy. We don't want to hear about it anymore. They forbid their community from reading the Septuagint because there are certain passages in the Septuagint that would favor the Christians in this debate. And they take all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible and they decide to standardize them, and they come up with the Masoretic text that's going to be the text of the Jewish community from there on out. About 100 AD, they're doing things that are logical, but few in the Jewish community even know that, and frankly, the Christian community even know that this transition actually occurred. And my point is that, look, for 400 or 500 years they're talking. Who's the other Yahweh guy? And they're getting that from somewhere. And I think that was the theology of the pre-Israelite biblical writers and the post-exilic. They're the pre-exilic and the post-exilic biblical writers. I think it's consistent. It does develop, but I think it's consistent. And so the text as we have it reflects that theology. My argument is that it does not reflect, and again, this is all, I'm saying this deliberately, it does not reflect a polytheistic belief system on the part of the biblical writers. The masses, God only knows what they're believing because they don't have Bibles, for one thing. They're just going to believe what they're told or what they're not told. They're just going to guess. They're going to wing it. I mean, again, it's just like today. It's no different than today. It's never monolithic, and it never will be or can be.
And on a related note, what do you make of the theory that Yahweh merged with El, like in the case of Baal? Like we see with battling the dragon god Leviathan and the divine warrior persona in general. Like many compare that to the merging of Ra and Amun in Egypt, as well as Marduk and other deities in Babylon.
Yeah, I don't think Yahweh's sitting out there in the spiritual world saying, gosh, I need to merge with one of these other deities. So I don't really like, the merging language. I don't know if that's a good way to describe it. What I do know is that the biblical writer wants his readers to think, okay, here's this El story in my head floating around, and then here's this Baal story floating around in my head. I think the prophets and the biblical writers want people to know, you know who's really in charge of this stuff that this one story has El in charge of, and this other story has Baal in charge of? You know who's really in charge of all of it? Yahweh. And so they put Yahweh in both boxes. Okay, that's the goal. That's the theological goal. So I don't know that using a term like merge or even syncretism is the right way to talk about that. Again, all I think we can really do is describe the sort of the phenomena of the text, that this is what they're trying to accomplish. And we ought not to try, because we can't, to be honest with you. We can't psychologize the writers. We can't like know when you wrote this was the exact train of thought that led you to write that sentence. Okay, we can't really know that. We can know that they wrote it. And the effect of it is something we can judge. And so that's where I try to camp out. What does the text say, and what's the theological impact of what we have here? The theological impact is a co-regent structure that is like a co-regent structure of Canaan. And that's nothing unusual, by the way. I mean, every ancient Near Eastern civilization had an ordered spiritual world. I mean, in other words, they didn't have the gods like Keystone Cops. All right. In the spiritual world, we would assume that if they're highly intelligent and if they're powerful, that they want and they accomplish order in their own world. They imposed kingship here. They want order here. So logically, they want order there. And so they make the simple set of assumptions. And the metaphor that's used, there's a bunch of metaphors. But one of the main metaphors is this divine council, thing, because that helps get the point across that the spiritual world is orderly. It gets the point across as to who's in charge. It gets the point of across as to, the concept of rebellion and obedience, all this kind of stuff. You need these things, you need to write these things in a way that people will understand, because they can see kingship, they can see earthly authority, they can see all that. And so what they take away from it, is what I'm really interested in. What's the impact of the phenomena of the text? Because we can all sit here and psychologize the writers. And at the end of the day, we don't have a prayer of knowing if anybody in the room is right. Okay, because we can't reproduce the things that were in their head that led up to the thing they wrote. All we've got is the thing they wrote. And again, we also can't impose a contrived chronology on the data. We don't know when a lot of this stuff was written in terms of chronological order. And so my objection is the chronology that the critical scholars, for the most part, impose on the text, this evolutionary trajectory from polytheism to monotheism, it is so flatly contradicted by data that follow that it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's like nobody got the memo.
You apparently get some criticism by a few uber-liberal readers for your views on Israelite religions, such as Elohim, which you take to mean a generic term for spirit beings. Like, you don't necessarily buy the idea that the Israelites viewed the spirits of the dead ancestors and prophets like Enoch, Melchizedek, Moses, Samuel, and Elijah as gods, like even in the Second Temple period, or even angels, as was the case in Ugaritic and Canaanite religion, or polytheism.
I'm not sure I'm following the question. What am I not saying in the question?
These are long questions. Like, you don't buy the idea that the Israelites viewed the spirits of dead ancestors and prophets, the above mentioned prophets, as gods.
Okay, let's just stop there. I don't think, again, I don't think that the people writing the biblical text and the people reading the biblical text and again assigning some importance and trying to have fidelity to it, I don't think they're sitting there thinking, hey, Grandpa is a god now. I wonder if he's out there creating a world somewhere. No, I don't believe they're thinking that at all. I think the language is they do believe that their ancestors are still alive. They have a life of some other nature, some other place, the underworld, the afterlife, whatever. So I do think it means as at least that, but I don't think they're like turning into superheroes or something.
You also don't.
That actually sounds a little bit like Mormonism.
It does, and I'm not a Mormon, so I feel free to reject that.
You also don't buy the idea that angels were gods, like in how the Ugaritic Canaanites believed.
Yeah, well, the angel is a functional term. So again, in my book Angels, I spend the first chapter talking about semantics, which I think a lot of biblical scholars fail to do. I'm just going to be blunt with that. There are essentially three buckets. Okay. The biblical writers use terms here. This is the first bucket. There are terms that describe what a thing in the spiritual world is. Those are ontological terms. Things like ruchot, like spirit or spirits. Elohim is a term that describes what a thing is. It's a spirit being. Okay. It doesn't really say anything about attributes or rank or hierarchy or roles or function or anything like that. It just, that's what it is. It's a spirit being. And then there are terms that describe rank in hierarchy, okay, or some kind of, administrative order. That's bucket number 2. These are council terms, divine assembly, all that kind of stuff, okay? And then the third bucket, I think, is the biggest one. And these are terms that describe function or role, what a thing does. So there's what a thing is, where a thing ranks, and what a thing does. Okay, 3 buckets. Angel is in the third bucket. It's a messenger. So in that sense, a malach, an angel, a messenger, is an Elohim, because the Elohim just means it's a spirit being. But it doesn't mean that they have the certain attributes of Yahweh or any other deity, because we have to look at the way those deities are described. We don't know, and frankly, in the Hebrew Bible's case, angels don't get certain attributes, certainly that Yahweh possesses, and they wouldn't have the same level of power and ability even in Ugaritic material. So, that's like, depending on how your question is read, the answer could be yes or no. So I don't quite know what else to do with that. But we need to stop merging terms. We need to stop merging semantics of terminology, because it creates confusion. Not only like in the early church and the average Christian. I mean, they have no feel. I mean, what church tradition does is it takes all the terms of the Bible and smashes them all together and calls it an angel. That's just not accurate. It creates all sorts of confusion and tension between both the Old and the New Testament, to just be really frank about it. It's why I can go into a church, and if I just went in there and started talking about Elohim, the divine council, people are going to look at me like I got 2 heads. And I might hold the very same theology. I'm a standard Christian Trinitarian guy. Okay, I hold the same theology this bunch does, and they're going to think I'm just some kind of wacko, because we're using the same terms, but we mean quite different things, and that needs to be addressed. And what I write, I try to address that, especially in the angels book, because everything's not an angel. That's just a job description. It's a job description that a particular member of the spiritual world has on any given day or whatever. That's all it is. It's a job description. It is not an ontological term.
And because you don't...
I was going to say, well, of course, not everything is angels. Politics pretty much confirms that.
Also,
in that case, everything's a demon? Oh, boy. There's a demon joke in there somewhere, but
demons in office. You also don't buy the idea of polytheist monolatry in general. Because of this, you get accused of having religious conservative bias. How did you come to your position, and what are your biggest reasons against the consensus view among critical scholars?
Yeah. Well, this is a good question, because all these terms, monotheism, monolatry, polytheism, henotheism, they're all modern terms. So we have modern vocabulary that we're trying to impose on ancient texts, and we're assuming that we're capturing ancient thinking. Not really. I mean, there are disconnects, there are problems with all of them. Polytheism, again, as we use it, assumes that all of the gods, all of the Elohim, are essentially interchangeable and have the same attributes. I don't think for a minute that a biblical writer thought that, because of the way they use the term Elohim. Monolatry is better, because then that says you should only worship one. Okay, so that much for sure is true. The question is, does monolatry address the distinction between the ontological distinction between the one worshipped and the other ones? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't. Monolatry, by definition, concerns only the one you're worshiping. It doesn't make any ontological statements. So it's better, but it's still inadequate. Henotheism suffers from the same problem. henotheism, the idea again that you got a bunch of gods, and one of them, somehow either through a conquest or some nature event or whatever it is, in an ancient culture, bubbles to the top, and then that becomes the top deity. Well, I mean, you could look at the Hebrew Bible in some passages and think, oh, that looks like henotheism. But again, if you're a henotheist, you assume that, well, tomorrow or 100 years from now, another deity might be the best one. And so the question is, did a biblical writer really think that? Did he think Yahweh was replaceable? Did he think Yahweh could be toppled by a deity that's equally powerful, equally, having equal attributes? Did he really think that? And my answer to that is no, they didn't think that. So again, henotheism is better than polytheism, but there are gaps in what it covers terminologically. And monotheism, again, is a difficult term. It's a modern term that really, if you read Nathan MacDonald's treatment of this, it's Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, he traces the monotheism as a term back into the 17th century. So that's a difficult term because it assumes that there can only be one God that exists, at least in the way that we talk about monotheism. Because if we have other gods existing, that would be polytheism. Well, why do we think that way? It's because we think of the letters G, O, and D as having something to do with a specific set of unique attributes. And that's the way we think. That is not the way a biblical writer thought about Elohim. So all four of these terms I don't like. Okay, I don't like because they're bad. I don't like them because they're inadequate. So what I tell people is, look, rather, you got to try not to be a modern person here. Resist the impulse to stick a label on something. Instead of trying to come up with one word that's a good label for something, let's just describe what the biblical writers believed. And that's what I try to do in my books. I don't come up with another label because there really isn't a good one. So we're kind of stuck. And so again, if I were cranky right now, I'd say, look, don't be lazy. Don't look for a label. Just take a minute and describe what the biblical writers would affirm and what they would deny. I mean, noodle that for a little bit and then try to describe it. Maybe come up with the elevator speech for that, 30 seconds or a minute. You don't need a label. Labels are inadequate. And so that is why I land where I do, not because, I took communion or something. It just, again, I get these things thrown at me because that's the only way people can think. And you know what? Even though I'm the target of some of that, so you might think that's my problem, it ain't my problem. It's your problem. Okay? The fact that I'm coming to a conclusion you don't like doesn't excuse you from trying to actually understand why I get there. Okay, because if all you're going to try to do is come up with a label or come up with some convenient explanation without actually listening and noodling it with me a little bit, well, I can't help you. I can't do that for you. So you need to do that yourself.
And speaking of polytheism, this is kind of a joke to bring up in an interview with an actual scholar, but once in a while,
try me.
Once in a while, a village atheist or a neo-pagan will bring up a couple verses where God would otherwise look weak, such as Judges 1:19 with the iron chariots defeating the men of Judah, and Kings 2:3, where it would seem that the Lord lost a fight to Chemosh, as was told in the Mesha Steel, where the Moabites defeated the Israelites and stole Yahweh's relics.
Right. Because we all know that God had to deliver the Israelites in every circumstance, no matter what. Right?
They usually bring up the fact that there was a prophecy about them defeating Moab and that getting overturned by another god. Like
it doesn't matter in the least. Let's talk about second Kings 3, because they're missing two things, at least two things, maybe more. Let's just take the bigger issue of prophecy, which would basically take another hour-long show to go through, but prophecies frequently. I don't know if it's fair to say that it's most of the time. That might be an overstatement. There are actual studies on this that I don't have the studies memorized, but it may be. I mean, it's a significant amount. Let's just put it that way. I don't know what the percentages would break down here, but prophecies frequently come with conditions. And I'm not talking a simplistic conditional statement like if then. There are other things lurking in the Hebrew text or the context that create conditions for a prophecy. And in many cases, again, I think you used the term village atheist or something like that here. The village atheist will not even be aware to even look for this stuff. And you got to look beyond English. There are actual studies on this, conditionality and prophecy and whatnot. It's actually really interesting. But since that's the long, analysis, let's cut to the short one.
That's what I call the angry atheists who don't come and go.
Yeah. Right. Do you really want to try to understand the issue or not, or do you just want to spout something? It's up to you. So 2 Kings 3:27, the outcome of this Moab, the Chemosh, thing. So the king of Moab, then he took his oldest son who was to reign in his place and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. And there came great wrath against Israel. And they, the Israelites, withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Do you notice what the verse never says? We aren't told that the wrath comes from Chemosh, are we? That's read into the passage. Like the deity, the Moabite deity is venting against Yahweh. And Yahweh's cringing in the corner. Oh, I give up. It's not in the text. We don't know who the wrath comes from. It could just as well come from the people or from the army. Maybe they were really ticked that the guy just killed his son. Maybe they liked the son. We don't even know how old the son is. Maybe he was popular. Maybe he was like a grown man and he's one of them. We don't know anything about the circumstance. Okay, second, the text doesn't say that Yahweh turned tail and ran. It says the Israelites turned tail in response to the wrath, whatever its source was. So here you have a bunch of Israelites who are supposed to believe. These are Israelites now. They're supposed to believe in their hearts that their God is the God of gods, the God who defeated the Egyptians at the Red Sea. And what do? Do they have faith? They even have a prophecy. Do they even believe it? Do they believe what God said? No, they don't. They just blink and they turn tail and run. So why is it God's fault if he chooses not to deliver unbelief? I got news for you. God says in a lot of places, I'm not going to deliver you if you don't believe. This is a predictable result. Why does Yahweh get blamed for this as though he took a beating? There's no textual proof for it. And the counter to it is that he will, in some cases, even punish unbelief. It's like ignored.
You sort of get that idea from as was told in the Mesha Stele.
Well, of course it's going to be told that way in the Mesha Stele. Who's writing it? Moabites, I mean, the Moabites aren't, let's reduce it to some really simple things. Question: should we expect Moabites to do Israelite theology?
Absolutely not.
Of course not. Okay, Moabites are going to put the best spin possible on the event, and they do. Isn't it interesting that the Hebrew Bible writers don't do that? The Hebrew Bible writers just say, our guys were chicken. Okay. They didn't believe it. They took, they turned tail and ran.
I don't think we need to stress the ridiculousness and illogic and the implications they give, but I like to hear an actual scholar's take on this suggestion that the same God that parted the Sea of Reeds and was said to have battled Leviathan, or any kind of God in general, was thwarted by man's tools.
Yeah. It's a good point. I want your audience, and I hope they're getting the impression here. Look, there's very little of what I have said in this interview that requires a PhD. I would say next to nothing. You know what's more important than a PhD? Clear thinking. Okay, asking good questions. Okay, you're not going to get a PhD for that, but it's really useful. It's really valuable. So don't get enamored with degrees and all. Okay, the guys with the PhDs, yes, we are good for something. Okay, and that is data, ferreting out data. Yes, some questions are going to depend on the knowledge of the original languages. Absolutely. I didn't waste my time getting a PhD. That isn't what I'm saying here. What I am saying is that you don't need a PhD to think well. Okay, you can do that on your own. And it's my job. This is why I do my podcast. This is why I write the books. I think it's my job as a scholar to give you more nuts and bolts to think well about, so that not just sit there and entertain yourself by doing Bible study, but so that if you're interested in this stuff, you got a lot more grist for the mill, and go at it, get busy doing it. I wish more scholars would do that, but please, if you're in the audience, you should not be thinking that you've got to go out and get a degree. You just don't. You just don't.
Like, yeah, but what's your take on the, even though the people I deal with on a regular basis don't normally think about this stuff.
Oh, I know.
I'm curious as to a scholar's take on the Iron Chariots debacle in Judges 1:19.
In which passage? Judges 1:19.
Yeah.
I have my software open. Let me go to that. Let's see. So the Lord was with Judah. He took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. So the question is, who's the antecedent? Let's see.
They like to imply that God was thwarted by man's tools, even though that makes no sense in any context.
Well, the part of the problem is, okay, and here you go. Here we have a case where an English translation is going to say, and I would imagine most English translations would say this, but he could not drive out. Guess what? We don't have the word he in the original language. We don't even have a finite verb form, like a third masculine singular verb form. We instead have an infinitive, and we have to supply a subject to that. So it would be overreaching the text to say that Yahweh is the subject of this verbal action. It's not a necessary conclusion in any way, not because of Mike's theology, but because of the text. You could just as well, make it an it. It could not drive out. Judah couldn't do it. Or they could not drive. The subject in terms of the person and number is ambiguous because we have an infinitive form, and infinitives do not have person and number. This is grammar. And I know, again, the village atheist is going to go, well, sorry, but the text is what it is, so don't make an argument that you think the text supports when it actually doesn't.
Yeah, and not only does that not make any sense, like the idea that it was defeated by a minor god like Chemosh when the Egyptian pantheon was no problem for him. Like, best excuse I hear for this one is the Exodus never happened tangent, and Yahweh made a mockery out of Dagon on numerous occasions.
Well, that's true. I mean, God can, do what he wants. But the reverse, the flip side is also true. God allows he doesn't allow, he actually, it depends on what passage you're in. Some cases he's like, whatever, I don't care what's happening to you, do you deserve what you're getting? Or other times he's actually taking the Babylonian army and crushing his own people for their disobedience and sending them into exile. Okay, the fact that Israel, like Judah, winds up, the 10 tribes just get scattered everywhere. The fact that those things happen don't mean that Yahweh was defeated. In some cases, the scripture is very plain that he actually does this to teach people a lesson. And sometimes the lesson is really harsh. And so you could read that into Judges too, because it's the period of the Judges, and it starts off the cycle of Israel forgetting Yahweh, and then they get oppressed, and then they cry out to Yahweh, and Yahweh raises up a judge, and then the whole thing repeats itself like 8 times in the book. It could be one of those too.
All right. Well, we're coming up at about an hour right now.
Yeah, let's just ask one question from Brass.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, which seems to talk about chattel slavery of foreigners, as well as the so-called sex slavery in Exodus 21?
Sex slavery in Exodus 21?
It has more to do with the Midianite story, I believe.
No, it's selling your daughter to as a slave to somebody.
Oh,
Is this from Judges or from Leviticus, or what? Where are we going?
No, it's
here?
from Exodus.
And by the way, I mean we have time to pick up 6 and 7 on the other list. If you want to cut that out, edit that out, make a note to yourself. I think with a lot of these situations, you get Israelites with their boots on the ground doing things that seem perfectly logical to them given their culture, as opposed to God sitting there thinking, I can't think of a better solution, so I'm going to command you to go out and do this. We have a very flawed assumption that the Bible, and these are Torah references, so let's just say the Torah here. We have a very flawed assumption that the Torah endorses a culture. It does not endorse a culture. There is no culture that dropped from heaven from God. And that includes the theocracy of Israel and what is behind a lot of this Torah stuff. I mean, in the examples you give, like Deuteronomy, if a man has 2 wives and he likes the one and hates the other, about not disowning the firstborn of the woman that he doesn't like, okay, it never tells you go out and create this circumstance. Go out, God says go out and solve your problem this way or do this thing. It reports that they do those things, and yes, God doesn't like send lightning bolts and say, you idiots, like what are you doing? First of all, again, there are plenty of examples where God has picked a people. He's picked them in second, first, whatever it is, millennium BC. They already have a culture in place, and God is essentially content, whether we like it or not, of using what he's got to work with. Now, we know from biblical theology that the theocracy was not a divinely handed down culture that was supposed to be here for time immemorial. How do we know that? Because biblical theology informs us that what God is really up to is to get humanity back to where it began, back to Eden. It's about defeating, all of the forces of chaos to get things back to Eden. Well, back in Eden, there was no Jew-Gentile distinction. There was no Jewish culture. There was no theocracy. Okay, there was no subjugation of women. Right? There were none of these things. And we know that that's the way the Bible is directing things because of the way the Bible ends with the new heaven and new earth in Edenic terms. And those late chapters in the New Testament draw heavily on the Old Testament. You get this stuff in the prophets. The writer of Revelation is not just making stuff up. He's drawing from an Old Testament vision of a new Eden, not a new Israel, not a new theocracy, not a new, something that's smaller than Eden or smaller than the whole world is supposed to be Eden. This is what God wanted in the first chapter of Genesis. And God is going to have his way. That's the message of biblical theology. Now, along the way, there's going to be lots of bumps. God has to break into history, call a dude named Abraham. Okay, his people are going to do this, that, and the other thing. They're going to do some good stuff. They're going to do some terrible stuff. His descendants, the Israelites, they are what they are. God made a promise to them that I'm going to use Abraham's seed to work the plan back to Eden. It's going to take a long time. You know why? Because God chose to have humans be indispensable parts of working back to Eden. God's not going to turn everybody into robots. This is why we still have evil. Why do we have evil if there's a God? It's because God at some point, namely at the very beginning, said, I'm going to create beings who are like me. They're going to be my imagers. And I'm going to share my attributes with them so that they can be like me and fulfill their destiny. And what I want them to do is I want them in my family. I want them to be partners in this world that I have created for them. And I'm going to come to earth and live with them. I'm going to be their God. They're going to be my people. And we're all going to be here together and enjoy it. There's no deficiency in me as to why I'm doing this. I just like to do it. I like to create things like me, and I want partners and kids. And so I'm going to create beings, humans, who are like me. And when I share my attributes with them, if I take their attributes away, namely human freedom, they're no longer like me. And that isn't the way I want things done. So, yeah, we can get angry at God that there's evil. But you know what? There's evil because God would rather have the fallout, pardon the pun, of that plan than to never have us at all. That is the story of biblical theology. And we make a terrible mistake. Instead of looking at the meta-narrative, we zero in on Torah passages and assume that God is endorsing this, whatever this point of culture is. Israelite culture was planned to be obsolete. It's planned obsolescence. But you're only going to discern that if you're taking the big picture look. Again, the meta-narrative, as we like to say. So I know that was kind of a long roundabout way of talking about these kinds of passages. But again, I think that there's a big bucket that basically a lot of these go into. They are what they are because of who the people are. And God is, he's working with what he has at his disposal, and he's not going to change them. He's not going to say, well, I'm going to work with you, but first you got to stop doing this and clean that up. And, over here. Now, once they enter into covenant, then, some things are going to be about believing loyalty. You don't do certain things that other people do when they worship their other gods, because then it becomes about their relationship with him, the exclusivity of that. But most of the time, more broadly speaking, it sort of is what it is.
All right, time for 2 more questions, and then we'll call it a night. You said on your podcast that you plan on doing a follow-up to Unseen Realm. Is it going to be a more rigorously academic version of the original, which was more aimed at a popular audience, and submit it for peer review?
I've gotten this question now a couple of times in the last week. There is no Unseen Realm sequel in progress. I'd like there to be one, but my wish is not corresponding to reality, and probably won't for a real long time. I would say when I get into that, let me put it this way. I'm not going to repeat Unseen Realm in another book. That's the first thing. Unseen Realm is very well sourced. I mean, it's not all this. I have over 6,000 sources in my Zotero bibliography for all things Divine Counsel and Unseen Realm. So, of course, I don't put that all in the footnotes, all right? It's quite well sourced in terms of peer-reviewed literature. It's not a book for scholars, though, because it's not intended to be. I don't get into source critical questions and parse verbs and do nuts and bolts philology and all that stuff. I let the sources do that. I let the stuff in the footnotes do that. So I'm hoping readers who want more information will go out to the footnotes and go search for that stuff and go find them. And many have, and I think that raises the bar for their friends and their churches, which is part of what I hope my work propels. I want people to look beyond my books, which is why I clutter them with data, with footnotes, okay? So I've gone through the material to ferret out the content. I present it hopefully in a decipherable way to non-specialists. And that's what I do. Scholars who want more, hey, use a library. You know how to do that because you're a scholar, all right? And I would presume that anybody else who cares will, again, do that instead of criticizing something in the book at a distance. Go look up the material, and just, do some work. I mean, it just takes work. So I can't reproduce all of that in a book. But I try to shoot for, again, let me put it this way. I literally have over 6,000 references of stuff that I talk about in Unseen Realm, or that I would layer, onto Unseen Realm content in a subsequent book. I am not hurting for data. And the fact that all that exists tells me that I don't need to produce much more of that. What I need to produce is stuff for the non-specialist. And so that's what I try to do. I just try to get people a distillation of what scholars talk about, again, hopefully in a readable, decipherable way, and then try to equip them, try to produce something useful for their own study.
Are there any projects you have in mind for the future? Like, I've heard rumors from our mutual friends at Sensible Apologetics that you are interested in doing an Unseen Realm movie or video game. Tell us about that. And you also said on guess that you have an Unseen Realm cruise ship coming up. How'd you?
Yeah, that's the most real of those three things you mentioned. The Unseen Realm movie. I'm not planning one and would never plan one. However, Faith Life, my former employer, again, they make Logos, the Bible software. They have filmed what we loosely called In the Building, the documentary, even though that isn't for my taste. Honestly, I don't know what to call it. So they have created a film that is based on the book. It's like a talking head film, with other scholars in it, and I, of course, will be in it. I don't know when they're going to air that. I mean, they did one a few years ago called Fragments of Truth. It was about New Testament manuscripts, and that was a Fathom event. So they may be thinking that. I don't know. I mean, honestly, nobody tells me. They didn't tell me when I worked for them. They're not telling me now. So, yeah, that exists, but I don't really know what's beyond that. Video game, there have been people who have suggested this to me. I don't have any skill in that area and don't have any funding for it, but I'll give the idea a thumbs up. Well, that would be cool. But that's kind of where it's at.
Like Adam and Eve and all these other cavemen in Eden and Yahweh battling Leviathan and all that.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd like to see happen is, I mean, my next book coming out, it comes out in a few weeks. It's called The World Turned Upside Down. The subtitle is Finding the Gospel in Stranger Things. Okay, the TV show. So what I've done in that is this is literally what my method was. I self-published this little book called What Does God Want? Because I wanted to be able to control the content to give that away in English, not in English, because this will sell the English to fund giving it away in other languages, because I have a nonprofit that is doing that. But I took the content of that book, which is for new believers or seekers, like, okay, what does God want? I mean, what's the whole point to all of this? And I answer that question. It's a short book. It's very readable. I mean, it's got almost 90 reviews already on Amazon. But then I took that and I mapped the meta-narrative story I have in that book to Stranger Things. And honestly, it was easy. Stranger Things, I don't know if your audience likes the show or not. I love the show. It is good storytelling, and it captures so well the human condition, the fact that we are as lost as Will Byers. We cannot save ourselves. Our salvation really focuses on something external and supernatural too. I mean, there's so many big meta-narrative things in the show, and I don't think they're doing any of this intentionally. They're not doing Christian stuff intentionally. It's just that good storytelling will map over to good storytelling. And so what I would love to see happen is I would love to see people create video games and write other books like the Marvel Universe, the DC Universe, anime, video games, whatever. Map the storytelling elements to the meta-narrative of Scripture, the supernatural meta-narrative of the Bible. Because I think it would really communicate important theological stuff to a visual audience and to an audience that just, all that stuff's going to be a bridge. to them. It'll speak really well. So I've done that with Stranger Things. I'm hoping that will prompt people to try to do the same thing with my content. That'd be awesome. I hope they do it.
Well, it's kind of like what Jordan Peterson suggests about superheroes being
Yeah, exactly.
like demigods.
And whenever that comes up, I always recommend. What's the guy's name? Christopher Nolan, I think. I mean, there are a bunch of Nolans that get confused here. But the guy who wrote the book, Our Gods Wear Spandex. Don't let the cover deceive you. It's kind of it's a comic book cover, but it's really a good book, and it's about how the superhero universes track on really big archetypal religious themes, and how they convey the same thoughts just in comic book form. It's quite good, and there are a lot of things out there like that, but to me, I think that's one of the more accessible books. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I highly recommend that book just to get your mind going on what the comic book storylines are really, what they're really tracking on. It's a lot bigger, than you might think.
I was thinking if the Unseen Realm video game gets made, the loading screen should just be like an animation of a Bronze Age goat herder just hitting a village atheist over the head with a club.
I thought you were going to say something about one of my pugs there, but go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in there. I mean, for anyone thinking about doing the video game, I'm sure they'd have to get some kind of usage agreement with the publisher, Lexum. I can't give that, but I think it's a great idea. I would hope somebody would do it. All right, we should say something about the cruise. I said the cruise is the most real. This was actually my wife's idea. She has a friend who was a travel agent. We are going to have a Naked Bible cruise in October of 2020. So if your listeners went to Naked Bible Tours, they would find the website for that, or they could just sign up for my newsletter. We have something in there. But yeah, it's going to be in the New England and on into Canada, above the New England states in the fall. So it's going to be awesome.
Not in the islands?
No, not this one. I mean, this is like a first, like kind of a trial run for the idea.
Oh.
But we know lots of people who've gone on cruises, and from what we've heard, I know somebody who's done it, and then people who've just attended. But the cruises are always looking for content experts in just about anything, so they can present lectures and talks during sea time. Because it gives other people something to do while they're at sea. And so that was the beginning of her idea with her friend, the travel agent, and this is just what came out. So yeah, we're gonna take a crack at this. People can already sign up for it.
I've been on a cruise once. I got sun poisoning. We were at the equator.
Yeah, well, I don't think that'll happen with this one.
No.
If we ever go down to the equator, yeah, wear your sunscreen, I guess.
My stupid ass went out without sunscreen the first day, and I did everything else except step foot on the islands.
All right. Well, we're going on about an hour, 20 minutes. Is all the questions good?
Yep.
Yeah.
You got any final thoughts?
No. I actually like this conversation. I think we did get to go through a bunch of details. We got to go through some biblical scholarship, and I don't know. I just had a good time with this.
Yeah, it was fun.
All right. This has been part 1 of Heiser House. Next time we'll be discussing his other books, Reversing Hermon and Angels, where we will talk about the angels, Lucifer, the old gods, all that good stuff. So stay tuned for that, and see you next time.